Yeah, so my name is Andrew. I'm from a company called Lookout Security. We're based in the US and California. But today I'll be talking to you about a topic that we've been researching since a little bit, but we kind of had some stuff come out in August of last year in the summer about an attack called Pegasus. So we'll look at that and a little bit about these nation-state level attacks that exist out there in the wild with several real-world examples. So to kick it off, let's look at a quick video of what actually the Pegasus infection looks like in the wild there. And if we could play the video, it may not auto-start. There should be a play button there to provide some context around the attack here. Does it work? No, I clicked the wrong button. Anybody? Maybe. If not, we can move on. Oh, there we go.
Wait a second.
Yeah, so this is essentially how the, just showing a clean device, the known IOCs aren't on there to kind of show you what happens before and after and kind of the quiet and silent nature of this attack here. But basically it's delivered through an SMS message. You click on the link, which ends up redirecting you to a web server that ends up loading your malicious code, exploiting through the Safari web browser, jailbreaking the device, and ends up installing the, that's all that actually happens basically. The Safari crashes and actually your device is infected at that point with any indication, no indication that anything has actually happened in this point in time. But we see now that the actual IOCs have been dropped on the device, indicating that it has in fact been compromised by this attack essentially. And so, a little bit more about what Pegasus is. It's an advanced lawful intercept tool that's sold by a company, by NSO Group, where we attributed the attack coming from. It's primarily sold for law enforcement intercept purposes, that term that's used around a lot. Unfortunately, though, it gets used in a variety of different ways where it may not actually be used for law enforcement. It might be used for other sorts of things, spying on other people and users and trying to phish them. So in terms of what happened with this attack that we saw on iOS, there was a high-value target that ended up receiving an SMS message. This is a text message. This is the real screenshot that he got. And had he clicked on this link, you would have seen the exact same thing happen. His device would have been compromised. All of his personal data and everything would have been sending off to the C2s and exfiltrated off of his iOS device. And this actually was working at the time on the latest and greatest version of iOS 9.3.3 or 3.4 at the time, which was vulnerable to these attacks just before iOS 10 had come out because it was over the summertime. So from that we were able to get that. It was a phishing attack, and these types of things are used in these high-value target cases, basically, right? They're not used across the wide vast of the population. They're used in very targeted, specific cases, like this case that we saw here. Now, a little bit more about targeted surveillance. These are kind of some three popular names that are out there that kind of sell this kind of software to a variety of different countries, groups, and organizations. To do targeted surveillance, right? So they'll either provide jailbreaks to break into a device, install the malicious payload and malware and espionage software, and go from there. This stuff is typically more expensive than you would find in kind of the commodity surveillance market, where just about anyone can go ahead on the internet and buy these types of products as well that will work on Android and iOS, whereas with the other ones, you'll probably have to do more of a deal and spend a little bit more money, 6 figures probably per single use. But there's a difference between what we have in commodity and targeted surveillanceware. And this spectrum is meant to illustrate that a little bit, right? So there's things like FlexiSpy, which we just use as an illustration point for the commodity spyware that's out there, is anyone can buy this. This will be used. It's less targeted in the sense that more people can use this out there in the wild on the population. Whereas things like Pegasus from NSO Group and others, it's used in very targeted, specific instances. And we'll kind of show you kind of counts and how we found this and stuff out later on. But we might not see it on our phones, but other people, as we've shown, if you're a politician, maybe not celebrities necessarily, but anyone that might be of high value and someone that is out to get for them will end up probably trying to buy this software and target them as well. So there is a different spectrum in terms of where this software exists and how it's used. Now, let's get into a little bit of the details about what it was that we saw for Pegasus for iOS in our period of time here that we have. So Pegasus, as we talked about, is espionage software. It is spy software. It does rely, though, on being able to jailbreak your iPhone device. So it actually has to compromise the device's security in order to install its malicious payload. Now, the way this was achieved, which we'll show in another slide or so, through an exploit chain that's nicknamed Trident because there were 3 separate vulnerabilities that were used in succession in order to enable to jailbreak the device. Once Pegasus is on the phone, actually, though, it's able to get access to everything. All of your audio, your recordings, hot micing the phone, all your video, text messaging, data communications coming into or out of the phone is all hooked, intercepted, collected, stored, and shipped off the device and exfiltrated. This also includes all the encrypted communications, right? So if you're using applications like WhatsApp and stuff that support end-to-end encryption, this isn't breaking the encryption, but because of the ability of it to get on your device and hook at the app layer, it doesn't need to break the encryption because it's at the point in the app where the file and the data is actually being decrypted to be shown to the user, so it actually can get that data without having to worry about breaking encryption and things like that. And so, more about the actual delivery, which is very interesting, is that this was a non-public, persistent, remote jailbreak. Basically meaning that this wasn't your kind of jailbreak that you would find on the internet that you would download from groups like Tag, Pangu, or Yalu. It was a non-public jailbreak. It was using exploits that were not known to the public. Typically, though, these types of things you'll find internal to researchers that are trying to jailbreak their device, but you'll also find these, as we've shown, in lawful intercept companies that are trying to provide advantages in their product to break into the latest and greatest versions of iOS and things like that. It was a persistent jailbreak. This actually is really important because a lot of the more recent jailbreaks that we've seen in the last two major versions don't actually have persistence, right? So when you reboot your iPhone, if you're an advanced or power user, you actually have to rerun an app in order to jailbreak the device and continue going from there. This jailbreak had persistence mechanisms, basically. So other terms that kind of float around about persistence is the term tethered or untethered. Tethered meaning from the older times when you jailbroke, you had to actually physically plug your iPhone back into your computer in order to re-jailbreak it because of how that process was working. Or untethered meaning you can just walk around, reboot the phone, it would still work essentially like that. One interesting thing I've noted about the persistence mechanism here is if you've looked at any of the Vault 7 archive stuff, they actually mention the same persistence mechanism in one of their PDF files as well. So that is an interesting call. It might have been a rediscovery of the same kind of mechanism to persist the jailbreak over time as well. And finally, it was remote. It was zero to minimal user interaction for this thing, right? They didn't have to install an app or go through any hoops. They simply had to click a link. Now, other advanced forms of this could have happened as well as just trying to get the code to auto-load in a WebKit context or Safari browser would have also had the exploit happen as well, which is interesting. So this is the exploit chain network, right? So it went from a spear phishing URL, and we'll get into why we sell single use there, but once you visited the URL, you actually could never revisit it again. It was burned, basically. You would get redirected to another site. The whole thing starts off with the WebKit remote code execution vulnerability, and these are the CVEs that are associated with each of these. Once that starts and you're able to exploit the WebKit process and get code running, then you can go to the next step, which is getting the kernel exploitation details, right? So exploiting the XNU kernel, which is what iOS is based on and running behind the scenes, getting the information leak to figure out where the kernel actually is laid out in memory, because there is KSALR there, so the base is randomized. So this is to figure out where it is, and then finally a use after free to achieve the jailbreak, and essentially to install in the stage 3 all the surveillance software, all the persistent mechanisms and things like that, and all the hooking, and then also do a check-in with the C2 servers in order to download all the necessary information, maybe see if there's an update for the software that needs to be deployed, and even also actually the ability to update any of the C2s that are in the code, right? So this code actually has the ability that if for some reason the C2s need to be changed at any point in time, it actually can go ahead and do that. And it does that through either updates in the software or actually through an interesting SMS texting protocol where it will hook the SMS text, and if it gets a text in a certain format, it actually will update its own C2s and go from there. These are actually the surveillance components that are installed on the device when it actually is exploited within the stage 3, right? There are several different processes, all responsible for their own different individual needs. Spawning all the sniffing servers to get the correct data, process managing stuff, reporting module pieces, all the Pegasus protocol and stuff is responsible from there, so that's the talking back and forth with the C2s. Well, the thing I mentioned before about talking about the audio, actually, so this actually implements a SIP client onto the phone itself, so that when the attacker wants to listen on the microphone, they can send a signal, turn the microphone on, and all the data, and all the audio data will actually from the microphone will be streamed and can be streamed over live over SIP actually, or back to the remote server. So it kind of acts like a walkie-talkie in some sense, except the user not able to turn it on. It's actually the attacker. And also, additionally, it does the app hooking through a process, something called CyInject, which is from a tool called Cydia, and we'll talk with a slide about that as well. Interestingly enough, they had renamed the package actually called Converter, so that if you saw it, didn't look very obvious, but when you did the reverse engineering, it was very obvious, just a repackaged version of CyInject from there as well. And then you have the dilibs. This is actually how you kind of do process hooking on iOS. So these dilibs get injected into each app process that they're especially supposed to affect. Basically, so there's one specifically for calling, specific different applications and things like that. So this package had these three here, but as we'll see, there was a lot of other different apps and APIs and stuff that they could hook into as well. Basically, Pegasus can be packaged so that you can get specific components based on the target or download new components as you go through with it. And finally, there were two other interesting pieces here. The root CA cert in order to talk with the SIP server with no cert errors that were SSL cert errors that would happen. And then finally, this piece here actually, which is a part of the persistent mechanism to basically run JavaScript code to re-execute and re-persist the jailbreak on reboot as well. They just named it something benign so you would think it might be a system app or a file on the device if you were doing scanning like that. As I talked about, these are all the targeted apps that we saw within the components and pieces there. Basically, any sort of messaging app and things like that, it will go after. And the good thing to note is that these are not repackaged versions of the applications, right? These are the applications themselves that you get from the App Store. And because they're doing the application hooking, they can modify the app at runtime on your phone. You don't have to get you to install a third-party malicious version of the app. And traditionally, the sandbox prevents this from happening. But once you've jailbroken the device, which is key to how Pegasus works on iOS, once you've jailbroken the device, then you've compromised the security. And then you can go ahead and hook the applications at the level that you want and get all of the data off of that. And as we talked about, it used Cydia Substrate in order to install these application hooks, dynamic library injection process, using through the process of CyInject to do this as well. So if you are a jailbreaker or you look up things like CyInject on the internet, that's the exact same process that's used in this attack as well. It's already built, so why rebuild it, essentially, in that case for that. Now what that looks like is a normal phone. You're talking through the different framework layers down to the kernel. But once the implant is in place, basically everything that's coming into or out of that application is intercepted at that point. So they can be selective or they can just grab everything and then pick and choose what they want to send out as well. In some sense, though, this grabs everything to send off to the device. So what else does it get? We talked about apps. So it actually will go into the keychain on your phone and pull out any passwords that it can see, right? So it's jailbroken, so it can go into the special pieces of each app, what passwords they've stored in, pull them out. It actually will go into and get Wi-Fi passwords that you've connected to, right? So now they have access to any network you've connected to as well, maybe your personal network or your corporate network, and go from there. It also additionally goes after any password you save to connect to if you have an Apple router or a time capsule to get into there as well. So it kind of, they can get the password and go from there, whatever they want to do with the data. It also does, user location tracking through GPS data, all the calls we talked about, and then basically all your personal information, your calendars, your contacts from address books, contacts from Facebook, anything basically that it has access to and it wants to get access to, it will exfiltrate off the device. And some of the interesting anti-analysis techniques that existed here, right? So I alluded to the one-time one-time use links that existed. If you tried to visit the stage one again, that link that we showed before, you actually would get redirected to potentially Google or another news site, depending on what the operator has set it up as. That's why it was really key when the high-value target there, Ahmed, received the link and he didn't click it. That preserved it for analysis to begin analysts to go and get the first stage and then to be able to get the additional stages as well to analyze and see this out in the wild. The developers of this actually took some time. They had some obfuscated JavaScript code to at least hide functionality of what they were doing. And they also obfuscated the Objective-C code that was also within the different parts of the payloads and things like that. And another interesting stuff, they looked at system services. And additionally, every time the second stage and the third stage were downloaded, they would actually be encrypted with a different key, right? So if you've gone to the work to reverse engineer and find the key to decrypt the second stage and the third stage, they actually would have a new key now when it came down as well. So you'd have to go and find the new key and to decrypt any additional samples that you might find out there. And then finally, a lot of the anti-detection techniques that exist there, right? So it would block iOS system updates for another way of maintaining persistence so that if an update were to come out and update the phone, it would actually potentially break this installation. So they wanted to prevent that from happening until which a case where they could update the phone and allow the system update the process. It also clears all its tracks as well during the infection. So Safari history is done. We talked about the SIP, and then it also has a lot of suicide functionality as well, to try to avoid people from detecting and understanding more about this, right? So if it detects it's under threat, for example, like if it hasn't talked to the C2 servers in a number of days, it will actually remove itself. If it, on initial infection, doesn't talk to the C2 servers within a day, it actually will remove itself. If it receives a command from the C2s, it actually will also go ahead and remove itself. So there is a fairly a lot of different ways of it removing itself so that when the surveillance is done, it can be deleted and removed without having to persist for the lifetime of the device. Now that was iOS. Some new news that just came out yesterday, which we finally just disclosed with a joint investigation with Google actually, is Pegasus for Android. So during the investigation, we suspected and we had read from notes that this potentially had existed for Android, but we had no evidence of it actually existing. So what happened was a joint investigation kicked off between Lookout and Google, where we shared our data, our threat intel data, and we basically found some very interesting packages that were on a very small subset of the Android population in the world. And then we'll go into those details in a second. But basically, the important information is the family name as given by Google is Chrysor, which actually means son of Pegasus, just to show the relationship between that. Interesting things, if you guys do Pokemon at all, is the internal development name in the code is actually called Jigglypuff, if you follow that stuff. But most of the functionality actually is very similar and identical to how iOS works, suicide functionality, process hooking, and things like that. And these are kind of the highlights of the stuff that exists there, right? So one of the things, though, is that this did not have any 0 days. Now, it was a little bit of an older sample, but was found active on devices within the last year. But though, because there's a lot of different OS versions out there, you can actually get a lot of mileage out of older existing exploits. So in this case, this is actually using the exploits called Frommerroot out there, if it wanted to compromise the device. But then it also would do all your key logging, your screenshot capturing, live audio capturing, all the remote controlling via the SMS, things like that, message data exfiltration from all the popular messaging apps, which we talked about. Also trying to pull all the browser history out through content providers and things like that, email exfiltration, and then also a lot of suicide functionality as well to remove itself, to get in and get out quickly enough so that it doesn't persist for a very long time. The couple differences about this besides the iOS one is that with iOS, it actually needed to compromise the device to install itself. And that's good on Android. So if you're on a version that supports the Frommerroot exploit, it can break into the device, elevate its privileges, install its super user binaries, go forward, and do all the really fancy stuff that you can do once you have system level and root level access on a phone. However, if that doesn't work, the app itself can actually still work and still can exfiltrate data due kind of just asking for too many permissions on the phone, because once this is installed, you can do a lot of stuff, grabbing contacts, calendars, information, because you have the permission to do it from the application space. So the interesting thing about this is that Pegasus for Android will still actually be able to get data off your device, maybe not to the extent that it could if it's compromised the device, but it can still essentially get a large amount of personal data off of the phone without having to do the compromise itself as well. Interesting stats about kind of affected regions in the world, and this is from Google's blog post on it from yesterday, is that there was about less than 36 infections, showing that this is highly targeted. The stuff wasn't actually in the Google Play Store. It's delivered through potentially phishing mechanisms and other ways to get onto the phone. But this is kind of the country breakdown of where the devices were found and where they were. You would expect the first one because that's the country where the company is located, so there might be some test devices also located in that bundle there as well. But these are the countries worldwide where this was seen to actually to have been implanted on the device itself. And this is kind of a comparison chart to just show the difference between iOS and Android as well. We highlighted the 0-day exploit to kind of show the difference as well between that, at least not in these samples that they were there, but you still can get some functionality out of the compromise if it's not been broken. And additionally, this functions as a standalone app as well, right? So if you're a malware vendor, you can actually write detections against the app itself to detect it and have it removed and go from there. If you're interested in reading more about the reports, these are the iOS reports and these are the Android reports. The technical reports are very technical. The iOS one is probably about 80 pages and the Android one is probably about 40 pages, which goes into breaking down the samples and all the unique different pieces about it. You can also do that yourself. The samples are up in VirusTotal. But if you want to read the analysis documents, this is a good one to read as well for all the nitty-gritty technical details that might exist there. And I think I'm just about at 20 minutes there. So thank you very much. If you want to talk later, I'm around, or just email me any questions. and we can go from there. Thank you very much.